Good evening. My name is Jim Bosnakis and I'll be your MC this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong Bun Wurrung peoples of the East Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. A warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, for our first event here at the Greek Centre for Contemporary Culture post-lockdown 6.0. It's an honour to stand here tonight and introduce our acclaimed speakers for the inaugural John Berger Memorial Lecture. I asked Nikos what he wanted me to say and he said, just tell them how this came about. And then I had to think pretty hard. But I do remember hearing the name John Berger for the first time in this building in its previous life from a lecture of Nikos's, before I actually even met Nikos. And in the words of the anti-vaxxers, I went home and did my research. So, as anyone could, they would discover an incredible body of work over many genres. Susan Sontag stated, Berger writes about what is important in contemporary English letters. He seems to be peerless. Not since Lawrence has there been a writer who offers such attentiveness to the sensual world with responsiveness to the imperatives of conscience. He's a wonderful artist and thinker. Over the years, a number of conversations were had where John's name would come up, and after he passed in 2017, it seemed a natural progression to not only honour his life, but use it as the inspiration for an annual lecture and other projects that hopefully will develop. Our first presenter this evening is John's son, Yves, who recorded this introduction a few weeks ago from his home in France to a live audience of 4. I'm sure you'll find it as touching as I did, and in the tradition of Moldova's groundbreaking album recorded in 1959, Kind of Blue, it was one take. Yves, if you're watching, greetings from Melbourne.
So, hello everybody, I'm Yves Berger here. So we've been friends with Nikos since a long time. How long is it? Something like 25 years or more, maybe almost 30. It's the first time Nikos came here in Quincy to meet my father, John Berger. And he came here mostly on summers to help us to do the haymaking, which we did at the time. And he came over many summers and we became close friends at that time and stayed in contact, even if our lives took different paths. And now he's in Australia and I'm still here in France. So we don't get to see each other much, but still, we're still in, as you can see, we're still linked together. And so since that time, which Nikos will tell you more about in his lecture in a moment, many things have changed and some things are still the same. And I will do a kind of little list of things which have changed and things which haven't. And I think you might understand why. So in the things which have changed, of course, quite a dramatic change is that both my parents are no longer living with us. My mother died in 2013 and my father 2017. And more recently also, the farmer, Louis, with whom we did this haymaking, because we'll also tell you about him, he died also more recently this year in June, last June. We've both, Nikos and I, got slightly older and have our own families. And in fact, my daughter now, Melina, who's 18, is more or less the age I was when Nikos came for the first time and when we met. So yeah, time has passed and with it all the changes one might expect. Yeah, that also reminds me of something more personal about my father and the fact that my father was quite old when I was born. He was 50. So I was always very aware of his age as being an old father. So I was counting in my head, when I would be 10, he would be 60, 20, he would be 70. And I didn't know how far it could go. And finally he lived until 90 years old, which I was hoping I could count until then, but I didn't know. So I was quite lucky. So yeah, all that has changed. But I tend to believe that maybe what has stayed the same is maybe more important. And let me tell you a bit about that. So for one thing, what is similar for me is that I still live in the same place, in the same house. My studio that my parents have built for me here, my studio for painting, because I'm a painter, is still the same. You can see a bit of it behind me. So I'm very much rooted in this place, and that is a continuity. Also around me, outside, the life in the village, the nature is very much the same. This morning, we had a frozen landscape because it's quite cold already in the nights, and a bright blue sky now today. And every autumn at this period, it's always a bit different, but basically the same. And it reminds you of all the other autumns, all the other seasons. And here again, there's a very strong continuity that is felt deep within us. The grass, the trees, the cows, for which we did the hay at the time, they are still here. There's no longer any cows of Louise, because, as I said, he's not any longer here, but still the same fields are haymaked, and there's still more or less the same number of cows in the village. That's to say more than the inhabitants of this village. And their needs are the same. Again, a strong continuity there. Another thing which is the same is our need to hear and tell stories. My father was very aware of that, and everybody who met him was always struck by how his capacity to listen to others and to listen to stories. And of course, as you know, in his books, he told many of those stories, even in the form of fiction. And that need is still there, and especially in a world that has changed since the time we're speaking of, but and maybe we can say it has even gotten worse. The tragic situation of many people in the world. But so this need I'm talking about is not only still here, but maybe even stronger. And also the stories, unlike human beings who have begin their life and end their lives, the stories, they can travel through time. And so the stories told by my father can still be read and told today. And yeah, here's is something which exceeds this question of time. Yeah. And with it goes also our need for a form of complicity and complicity between us. Like Nikos and I, we had this complicity when we were together, and even if now were not any longer physically together, we still kept intact this complicity. And everybody in their lives needs complicity towards others. And stories help this complicity to go on living. And also it gives hope. And that's maybe where I want to come, is that our need for hope is still the same, and is dependless of the time we're in. And I think many people who reacted to my father's writing say how much reading him has given them hope or helped them to find reason for hope. And I think, Nikos, you say something quite similar in what you tell about your encounter with my father. And since my father died, now I'm taking care of all the things to do with his books and decisions for publications and all that. And we notice that the interest for his writings and thoughts is not going down at all. On the contrary, it seems to touch more people in different countries, in new countries, and with always new projects. And so even if he's not writing anymore and active with us, his thinking and all what he left is still there with us. And again, here there's a very strong continuity. And so all this thing, those barriers we tend to put between the living and the dead, in fact, it's much more fragile what we tend to think, I believe, because the reason why I'm here now in front of you today comes from the past, from the story of somebody who's dead. But here we are, we're living, and we wouldn't be here if what he left wasn't still active and participating in our lives today. So I think that's enough for this introduction. Just to give a conclusion, I think we can say that we all follow each other. Nikos followed the writings of my father, and that brought him here. And as we follow each other, I'm glad that this event is now happening, and I'm very thankful for the Greek Cultural Center to inaugurate this annual lecture. And I wish them a lot of success. Thank you very much.
The first time I saw that. John may be gone, but look what he's left us. Our next presenter does not need any introduction to our audiences. He has generously donated his valuable time over and over to us. His own CV would be a topic of a whole lecture. Nikos has been the guiding light in this and many other projects. He's the Director of Research Unit in Public Cultures at the University of Melbourne and is a Professor in the same institution of Culture and Communication. It gives me great pleasure to invite him to present the inaugural John Berger Memorial Lecture.
Surely, John, you must have tired of saying this to me. Write stories like the way you tell them when we are all gathered here. All the time I knew you, John, I never had the courage to totally let go of my academic handrails. You always got what I was addressing, and more importantly, you knew exactly what motivated me. but you lamented at my tendency to also rebound within theoretical debates. You even complained that it resulted in a constipated style. It's true. When I was writing about migrant experiences, referring to artistic practices and building on philosophical frameworks, I pressed too many things together. I was trying to understand and master too much all at once. There was almost no breathing space and such insecurity about what another mentor of mine called the fear of not looking dumb. Now that you're not here and I'm at the end of my academic career, I hope you can finally hear my kitchen voice in this text. For the last 2 years, we've all been stuck at home. I wrote this piece without access to my library. The COVID blues meant no travel, but a flood of memories. This text, or this portion of the text that I've written since then, is a product of that forced freedom. It is a sequence of anecdotes which I present now as fragments that give a glimpse of your wisdom and the times we had together. I had the good fortune to spend so many days and nights with you and your families. I and many, like many others, have felt that your stories have given words and form to our only half-worked out hopes. Even many who have never met you have often told me that they inhabit your words and have lived with you as if you were their imaginary secretary. John visited his daughter Katia in Athens when she was pregnant. Katia met Orestis Andriadakis in the dark. They were both film critics attending the Cannes Film Festival. One night, Orestis took John to a tavern where Rebetika was being played. John was spellbound. Soon after, he asked me to send him some information about the Greek blues. I made a cassette and sent a copy of The Road to Rebetika. He played that cassette many times, read the book carefully, and lightly marked up some of the songs. That was the sum total of the information that he had received. From memory, I recall that John wrote this book to the wedding from the perspective of a blind narrator, a rebeti called Nikos. At one point, he describes a man dancing the zebekiko. And he says, when the dancer enters the floor, it is as if he is alone inside a cage. The music is received on the body like a tattoo. Everything you need to know about zebekiko music and the rebetika style is distilled with this exact precision in these two phrases. And if you think John fluked it with the essence of rebetika, then consider the reception he received in a range of other fields. In 1968, he sent a message to the novelist Mulk Raj Anand, who organized the first edition of the Triennial of India. It is a brief note of solidarity with those who are committed to escaping from and even overthrowing the disastrous legacy of imperialism. He goes on to link then the struggles in modern art with political projects and personal feelings. Recently, the outstanding writer and curator of contemporary art, Nancy Ajani, fastened onto this little correspondence and declared that this was a precursor of the globalism before globalism. Since the 1950s, John was an art critic. He had a weekly column for the New Statesman, as well as writing for many progressive magazines. In 1966, John wrote an essay called The Historical Function of the Museum, in which he predicted, in 1966, that museums would no longer be confined to places for preserving precious objects and overseen by snobbish connoisseurs. On the contrary, they would have to connect to the energies of the street, driven by the imagination, and become an open school where people could see themselves through the process of their own participation, rather than in the reflection of products that already affirmed the place of the powerful. When I forwarded this essay to Hans Ulrich Obrist, the Swiss artistic director of the Serpentine Gallery in London, and currently the most influential person in the art world, he replied by describing it as a prophetic essay and the most amazing act of telepathy. Towards the end of his life, John visited Ramallah and Gaza, cities that he had named as the world's largest prison. Part of John's ancestry is Jewish. Contemplating the images and the bombings and the drawings by Palestinian children and the words of flight in the poems by Mahmoud Darwish, John wrote a number of testimonial essays, which, as the scholar Juman Simwan noted, stood up like a martyr or an olive tree. John had this uncanny gift for metaphors. He'd always drawn on the experiences of the marginalised, the persecuted and the uprooted. In his acceptance speech to the Booker Prize for his novel G, he famously denounced the award-giving institution for benefiting from the historical crimes of slavery. He announced that he would share half of the proceeds with the Black Panthers in London, and the rest would be used to finance the research for his next project, a book that focused on the migration of the peasants from the south of Europe to the industrial north. The Black Panthers accepted the gift and used it to buy a large terrace house in the north of London. The screenwriter, Farouk Dondi, told me that the place was used more for debating rather than planning the insurrection. The discourse was all going well until one day a crazed man, armed with an axe in one hand and a machete in the other, came screaming down the stairs. Everyone legs it, the house was abandoned, and guess what? The revolution, well, that revolution never happened. John's book, A Seventh Man, was a pioneering study of the psychology and social experiences of the peasant migrants. It is an unparalleled masterpiece. John and his friend, the Swiss photographer Jean Moore, retraced the journey of peasants from their villages in southern Europe to the industrial cities in the north. He noted the way rumours spread. He observed the impact of commodities purchased by new salaries. He listened to the stories that one cousin told another. He followed the trail of suitcases at train stations. They recorded the callous medical inspectors and cruel customs officers as they processed the Gastarbeiter. He tried to tell the story of the migrant's eye. In his words, in a dream, the dreamer wills, acts, reacts, speaks, and yet submits to the unfolding of a story which he scarcely influences. The dream happens to him. Afterwards, he may ask another to interpret it. But sometimes a dreamer tries to break his dream deliberately by waking himself up. This book represents such an intention within a dream, which the subject of the book and each of us is dreaming. A Seventh Man, like almost all of John's books, have been translated into many languages. When my mother read it in Greek, she sighed. It was like he was riding on my shoulder and that he had lived inside my head. So how did I meet John and come to be in a position to assist in his writing? Towards the end of my dissertation in Cambridge, my friend Deborah Levy, who was a Trinity College writer in residence, invited me to a dinner and sat me next to the distinguished visiting professor, Theodor Shanin. Deborah informed me that he and I had a lot in common, as he was the world authority on the sociology of peasants. However, she also instructed me not to go home until after he left. I dutifully chatted with Theodore, and at one point he asked the customary campus question, "What is your dissertation about?" I proceeded to give him a brief outline of my approach on the theme of exile in John Berger's writing, but mostly I zeroed in on the particular theoretical problem that I'd been trying to resolve in my head earlier that day. I had this habit of responding to this customary question by verbalizing my day's work. Theodore was not impressed with my tangle of theoretical knots, and he snorted out, "You make a friend of mine sound like he's dead." I had no idea that Theodore and John were fellow members of the Amsterdam-based Transnational Institute, and that Theodore's work had influenced John's trilogy, Pig Earth, his collections of short stories and novels on peasant life. However, Theodore's comment was like a red rag to a young bull. We charged and swerved at each other. Finally, Deborah had enough. With tabbouleh in one hand and chicken in the other, she insisted that we change subject. Theodore did not give up so easily. He invited me to continue the debate in his rooms the following afternoon. When I inquired at the porter's lodge for the room of the professor that they had previously mistaken for the new gardener, I was directed to make a right at the main quad, go to the end on the ground floor, and I couldn't miss it, as this was the old room of Sir Isaac Newton. Theodore was sitting behind a massive desk. He opened a bottle of Armenian cognac, and we continued where we had left off the night before, neither of us giving ground on the priority of theory and experience. Suddenly, Theodore paused, picked up the phone, and thundered, "Let's ring John." Fuck, I thought. He has the room, the cognac, and the direct line to God. To my relief, it was John's partner, Beverly, who answered. She told Theodore that John was out for the day. They made some giggling small talk, Theodore scribbled a number on a piece of paper, and after he hung up, he ordered me to ring later that evening. As a former military commander, Theodore knew exactly how to give orders. I walked home, heading down the back lanes, passing the house of Clive James and across the fields of Jesus Common. All along, I was scratching my head with anxious nervousness, and when I got home, I scrambled to find as many gold coins as I could, and that night I went to the near payphone and rang a French number, 3345033036. A delicate "hello" answered. I immediately went on to a starstruck rant. John then interrupted and says, "Nikos, would you like to come and stay with us for a weekend?" There was a sign in the graduates' common room of my college. "If you have an idea, we'll pay for it." I approached my head tutor, Professor Andy Holmes, and he issued the funds for a plane ticket to Geneva. This was my first of many visits. Now, I can't say this for certain, but I am pretty sure that John was a pretty lousy sportsman. He was definitely a goofy dancer, and he refused to sing. Musical instruments were held by him in the same awe as astronomers hold for the stars. But put him in front of any musical instrument, even the basic alphorn, and he froze. It would often rain during the haymaking season. During these interruptions, Eve and I would have epic ping-pong battles. John would put on his BBC commentator voice, and he kept the score and revved up his son. Occasionally, he would play the winner. He had a dangerously supple wrist that could unleash a wicked backhand flick smash. But he also had zero patience for building up the points. On the motorbike, by contrast, he had a very light touch and a beautiful, gentle balance. He loved dressing up in full leathers, gloves, and helmets. He would say it's the closest thing to being an astronaut on this earth. He always rode the latest and fastest Honda. I almost killed myself taking the Blackbird out of the showroom. By contrast to him, my BMW was of the basic design that was common since the First World War. His bikes were straight out of the jet age. Speed on the straight valley roads was a thrill, but his true delight was in gliding along the curving mountain passes. He loved the view from the Col de Fossile on the Jura Mountains that led to Lac de Genève, which Ruskin, with some fairness, described as the best view in the world. John was indifferent to sport. He enjoyed swimming, though. But for him, swimming was more like a floating therapy than a physical exercise. However, in a museum, he moved like a hunter and an acrobat. he would lean in a bit too close for the comfort of the museum guards. On one occasion, I was tilting my head to see a painting from the bottom up. He noticed this switch of perspective from a distance, and he came sly-tackling in along the carpet to get that horizontal view. In equal measure, he would hunch up and flap his arms. The clouds in the Renaissance painting seemed to lift him above the ground. He felt free and light in the company of Titian. When I first arrived at Geneva Airport, John was waiting with Katya. John was relieved that his daughter was liberated from her timid Swiss boyfriend. She was dating Orestis Andriadakis, and he wanted her to meet another Greek. It was the beginning of the winter, and John anticipated that I would be inadequately dressed to face the piercing air of the Alps. Before mounting his Honda, he dressed me with a Swedish army coat. Nothing could pierce that. It was the same coat that he used as a mental map for describing the squatters' camp in his novel King. On the morning of the second day, while making coffee in his white dressing gown and tartan slippers, he asked me if I had any questions for him. I replied, "John, I've read so many of your interviews that I feel like I already have all the answers to all your biographical questions and political influences." He threw his hands up in the air and yelled, "Great! Let's put up the flag of freedom!" But as I flew back to Cambridge, I realized that I got so much more from John than corrected facts and additional references. I got a glimpse into how he made sense of things. I saw him pull over to admire a large tree. I appreciated the courtesy he showed to shopkeepers, and above all, the deep reverence he held for his friend, the neighbour and owner of his house, Louis. Louis owned 3 houses, a number of fields, 17 cows, and from the end of his street on a rare fine day there was a magnificent view of Mont Blanc. On my first visit I saw it, promptly took it for granted, but never saw it again. It was almost always covered in cloud. The cows, of course, had to be milked every day. In the spring and summer they enjoyed the lush mountain grass. This region, the Haute-Savoie, is the home to some of the best cheesemakers in the world. In the winter, the cows stay in the barn, and where they are fed hay and some grains that John mischievously called Mars-bars. Apart from his year of military service, Louis never left his cows. In his lifetime, that village shrunk. All the young women had left to get jobs in factories. In exchange for the mud and shit of the village, they got to make tiny parts for the aeronautical industry and 4 weeks of annual leave. Louis was pensive and courteous, but he also had a devilish smile. If I ever brought a girlfriend to the village, he would always greet me in the morning with, "Dormir ça va, Nikos?" When he put on his dentures, and while he was dancing, you wouldn't recognize him. He also played the saxophone at night, and if he noticed that Eve and I were coming up the hill, he would start on Hadzidakis' tune for Never on a Sunday. During haymaking, Louis drove a German Mengele tractor. Spooky. He would cut, turn, and pick up the grass. Then he would dump it all at the entrance of the barn. This is where Eve, John, and I stood. On the road trip to Concy, I followed the road that John would take across France. He would traverse the country on the small D roads, the department roads, leading from Calais to Lens, Cambrai, Saint-Quentin, Soissons, Troyes, along the Seine to Dijon, then over the Jura to Genève, and then the home straight to Mussy. John resisted taking any of the toll highways that to him were as boring as the experience of a prisoner. Counting out the miles was like notches on the walls. As I rode from one village roundabout through to the next and admired the quaint stone houses, appreciated the care with which the potted geranium flowers were hung on balconies, and counted out the diminishing proximity to Paris, I often asked myself, why not live here? Why did John choose to be so far from the centre? And why so high up in the mountains? However, as I approached his village, I noticed something different. There was a toughness to the timber used on the barns, a restraint in the use of floral decorations, a severity in the granite mountain edges. The landscape seemed to resonate with the laconic, measured, and stoic nature of the villages. When the haymaking finished and we gathered for a celebratory dinner, Louis would be in his high, and he would gently mutter, "Nous ne sommes des partis les plus malheureux au monde." His highest ecstatic words were, "We are not amongst the most miserable in the world." John had found his people and the place that was a foundation point for him. After Louis dumped the load of hay, he would drive off to the next field to cut more grass. Then John and I, with pitchforks in hand, would load a machine that spewed the grass up to the attic of the barn. The young Eve would steer the funnel so that the grass would fall as neatly as possible into the rafters. It was hot, ticklish and dusty work. We wore surgical masks that I had purchased in a London store from a Harley Street chemist. In between the loads, we sometimes had moments of respite. Eve would scramble down and would play pigeon toss, throwing coins against the wall. The one closest would win a bottle of Chateauneuf de Pape at the end of the campaign. The year Scott came, he would use his Inspector Gadget long arms and win a little bit too easily. On some occasions, we rested near the trough where the cows drank the water that came straight out of the mountain springs. We washed our faces. The theatre director and actor Simon McBurney also came to help one year. Of course, he had to strip naked and totally dunk himself to cool. As we sat in the shade, I asked John, "You have ancestry that takes you to Trieste, the region where part of the novel G was set. You live part of the year with Nella in Paris. You've lived in the Forest of Dean, where you wrote that miraculous book on a country doctor. And you were raised in South London. When you die, where do you want to be buried?" He replied, "Right here, in Concy." When John and Beverly moved to the Haute-Savoie, they lived even higher up the mountains. The house is now an exclusive chalet, but back then it had a barn as big as an art school, no electricity, and an outdoor bog with a view to rival Ruskin's favourite. Every morning John would sit outside with the door open to the heavens. When Beverly was pregnant with Eve, they decided to move down the valley to Concy. At that point, there was even a small cafe in the village. They now had electricity, but John still had to disassemble the bog and empty the pit at least once a year. A year before I met John, I had lunch with Edward Said, the author of the Magisterial Orientalism and the brilliant campaigner of Palestine. He talked with reverence about John's work and even more warmly about John. But then he added, "But whatever you do, Nikos, don't ever go to visit him in the village. There are pigs and shit everywhere." I replied, "That sounds just like my father's village." The book Ways of Seeing started out as a 4-part documentary for the BBC. John had a tiny budget but an outstanding team. It was shot mostly in a studio that was adjacent to a railway line. Takes had to be timed during the intervals of the passing trains. At first, the series was screened late at night. It developed an immediate cult status and was rescreened regularly. The book that followed has been a bestseller ever since. No art, media, or cultural student can ever complete their degree without at some point passing through the clarifying pages of this book. It's been translated into countless languages and millions of views on YouTube. The BBC still enjoys the handsome royalty fees, whereas John and his team, they just got a straight flat fee. My father always said that clothes made of expensive material turn out to be cheaper, and you should never seek to save money when shopping for food. John was the same. He had no idea about fashion, but loved the cashmere scarf that I wrapped around his neck. He once took Eve and I to the most expensive restaurant on the hillside facing Geneva. We were on motorbikes, and the blue-rinsed ladies had their chauffeurs waiting outside. The fish was extraordinary. The waiters laughed a little bit too loudly at our jokes, and in the end, they presented our bike helmets in a kind of coronial, ceremonial manner. I once asked John why he never bought the house in Consey from Louis. He was clearly very attached to it. His desk was upstairs at the end of the bedroom. In the kitchen there was a pot-belly stove that kept the room cosy in the winter. They even installed a hot shower decorated with the old Delft tiles. Beverly was working for a prominent publishing house when they first met. She had recalled that John did not even possess copies of his own books. If someone ever expressed appreciation of any of John's possessions, his reflex reaction was to give it to them. Beverly first felt compelled to at least buy one copy of each of his books, and then she saw them in a secret built-in cupboard. This collection, which now includes all the translations of all his books, has migrated to the archive in the converted pigsty that sits opposite the house. Beverly also made sure that John's essays were dispatched to publishing outlets in London, Stockholm, Hamburg, Paris, Madrid, Mexico City, and Istanbul. Her grandfather was the Bancroft, who was the main philanthropist to the University College, University of California, Berkeley, and the main highway leading to the campus is named after him. But she was content in the house. She loved the garden vegetables and the wild blackberries. And when Eve emptied the dishwashing machine, she would tenderly exclaim, "Oh, my son." So why didn't they buy the house? John replied, "I've noticed that whenever a peasant sells his house to, say, a Swiss family, so that they can use it as a summer home, and no matter whether the price is fair or not, the peasant always feels a lament in the contract. He or she feels as if he has betrayed his ancestors." I don't want to give the impression that John had a monk-like disregard for material possessions. Artists, especially photographers, often gave him their work. He treated each piece with great care and attention. As he stared into an image, he would sigh, rub his thumb and index finger together, then a little insight would flash in his eyes, and finally, a string of metaphors and similes would come tumbling out. However, there were very few images that adorned the walls in Consey. There was an enigmatic poster from a Renaissance painting of a pregnant woman that was glued into the arch under the veranda. In the kitchen there was a barometer that only John believed in, and usually an odd charcoal drawing near the coat rack. By contrast, Eve's room was full of Guns N' Roses posters. Michael, John's younger brother, came for lunch one day. He needled John about his lack of sentimental attachment. John stood up from the kitchen table, put his hand directly above his head where the shelf ran along the fireplace, and pulled down an antique compass that sat next to the lantern. This compass was Dad's. It was in his pocket throughout the First World War. I can still feel the heat of that body. I visited John in Paris on 4 occasions. He lived there for part of the year with Nella Bielsky, a vivacious Russian author. She had very high hopes for John. There was always an empty spot on her bookshelf, a waiting station, she called it, for his next novel, which she also believed would win the Nobel. John's book on longing and love and our hearts, our faces, as brief as photos, was written in the times of the approach to and departure from Nella. Their home was in Antony, a suburb near Orly Airport. In Antony, John witnessed the bristling expansion of a multicultural metropolis. John was in every sense a cosmopolitan, most at home when he was one among a multitude of strangers. Yet the hustle of everyday multicultural exchanges only came to him late in his life. At the local pool, he would find relief. Floating in the water, the aches lifted and the grind of bones on joints were forgotten. While dog paddling, he enjoyed the conspiratorial glance of pensioners from every continent. The last time we met in Paris, my daughter Maya was with us. He prepared a feast, laughed raucously, spoke about an essay on Charlie Chaplin that he was working on, and then he took Maya to the side so that they could draw together. When John draws, he stares intensely, squinting into details. His body hunched over the pad, arms wide, sighing as he strokes the paper. The rubber is as active as the pencil, and if he's using charcoal, all his fingers are smudged. His energy is relaxed but hyper-alert, sizing up the subject like a front row hooker entering the scrum. Maya was still a kid. Her hands moved on the notebook without evaluation. He loved her freedom. I hope somewhere in her body that this memory will always be with her forever. She now tells me it is. In the first summer that John met Beverly, he also learned photography. In the limited edition of Pages of the Wound, there are black and white photos of her curves, images that evoke those long, amorous afternoons when the sun lets its shadows grow longer and longer and also somehow forgets to set. He was drawn to the camera as a means to explore intimacy. At the same time, Susan Sontag had launched her polemic text on photography. She challenged the way photographers used this tool to rip images out from their context and the way that they fed perverted fantasies. She showed how the camera was instrumental in decontextualizing history and commodifying subjects. It was a weapon for surveillance and a means for pornography. John never disputed these tendencies, but he hung on to the redemptive uses of photography. In a television interview, I should have caught up. We know that there is, and that's the amorous afternoons. In a television interview with Susan Sontag, he faces her across a wide table. Sontag is upright, fierce, and precise. John is constantly leaning over the edge of the table, trying to get closer towards her. His hands are busy fumbling for words. As he bends forward, it is as if he's attempting to smuggle in something that an interview between experts is meant to forbid: doubt and play. Sontag will have none of it. She's impervious, imperious, and indomitable. John learned much more from his friend, the photographer, Jean Moore. They collaborated on over nearly 10 books together. But it has to be said, it rains a lot in the Alps, even in the summer. And this can delay the haymaking, and even worse, it can ruin the hay because the nutrients rot while it's cut. During such pauses, Eve and John would often draw. Sometimes I would model for them, or else I would go and chop some wood. I love the feeling of a heavy axe falling into the sweet center of a log and then seeing the chip flying into the air. Just as I was completing one such mighty swing, a small white car turned around the corner of the barn and pulled up right beside me. The large chip of the wood gracefully arced over the open rooftop, gliding past the smiling face of the driver, and then landed with a gentle thud on a damp verge. It was all in slow motion, and I was horrified. But the driver, Jean Moore, seemed unperturbed. Jean lived in Geneva. He had come over for coffee. John was thrilled to see him. He could not stop talking and showing him different things all afternoon. Jean nodded, sipped his coffee, smoked a few cigarettes. John was tall and lithe. His left shoulder was a little bit tilted, and there was a slight groove forged by the straps of his equipment. It was delightful seeing John putting on such a performance. The following weekend, John returned with a batch of photographs. There were countless images of John, his eyes sparkling, his smile and stubble glistening. I was sitting at the same table when all these photographs were taken. I don't recall seeing Jean pull out his camera. If he did, it must have been in between the breaths. Everyone dreams of a doctor that understands your body and soul. Understanding is the torch that opens the way for care. This dream starts with a deep memory of being in your mother's womb, a total enclosure, a place where there is everything. John's portrait of Cecil, the country doctor and a fortunate man, is as close to reality as this fantasy permits. Cecil was perceptive and empathic, dutiful and discreet. Cecil was John's doctor when he lived in the Forest of Dean, that ancient woodlands that borders with Wales. John had a profound respect for doctors. He admired anyone who could use their skill for the care of others. The local doctor in Kansi was called Michel. He had silky blonde hair, an all-year tan, piercing blue eyes, and a very, very delicate demeanour. We made social visits a few times in the summer. Michel invited us to swim in the family pool. Eve and I would clown around doing bombs, John relaxing into his dog paddling laps. In most groups, it was John who was the most attentive listener, but Michel basked in the pleasure of watching us swim, and he was the master at listening and probing. Over lunch, I noticed how when he did speak, John would move closer, right to the edge of his seat, as if poised to stand. After the publication of A Fortunate Man, Cecil, the country doctor, enjoyed a period of fame. The book was published at the time of the thawing of the professionals. A number of medical schools in Britain included the book in their curriculum. Young trainee doctors made their way to the Forest of Dean in order to learn from Cecil. They wanted to witness the example of his companionship with patients, to emulate his touch and absorb the way he allowed kindness and knowledge to feed each other. John told me that Cecil welcomed this attention as an extension of his pastoral role. However, Cecil also took stock and reflected on the one aspect of his life that was sterile. He had married early in life, and the marriage remained a quiet but cold expression of obligation. He eventually divorced. Soon after, he fell in love. It was a kind of love that Cecil had never previously experienced. John said that along with Cecil's usual laser-like focus, his eyes suddenly radiated an emerald happiness. On the day of his marriage, Cecil locked the door to his study, sat behind the mahogany desk, and shot himself. This suicide was a total mystery to John. He could not fathom in what abyss Cecil had fallen on that day. I cannot pretend to understand or explain it either, but I imagine that for a man who had focused so much on the care for others, that this sudden outburst of love, totally inside and all around him and his beloved, this must have felt like a solar eclipse, seething, pulsing, explosive, almost too much. John felt a little bit of pride that his presence in the village kept the postman coming and the alcohol inspector from discovering the secret stills in everyone's stellas. The Guardian, Le Monde Diplomatique, El País, New Yorker, and letters with exotic stamps arrived daily. John was a passionate correspondent. His letters to Subcomandante Marcos was the stuff of legends, and his exchange with Leon Kossuth contains the most brilliant insight into the life of an artist's studio. He would laugh at the cartoons in the New Yorker, but I don't ever remember seeing him read the newspapers. Maybe he saved that for the bog. Beverly, by contrast, read the news very delicately, gently drawing on her cigarette, sipping a coffee as she turned each page slowly. When I was a child, we would visit friends and families, our family friends on weekends. Before the kids were let out to run and play on the street, there was this little civil period where we were received in the immaculate living room. We sat quietly on the new couches in our clean clothes. The parents made small talk. We were offered sweetened figs, nuts, and sometimes mastica was served on a long spoon in a tall glass of water. While the parents talk, the kids remain in their blocks, and I would daydream, stare at the collection of checked crystal glasses, and then lock eyes with that hideous monstera plant in the corner, which I was convinced my aunt nurtured in the hope that one night it would unfurl its wicked leaves and swallow up my snoring uncle. And I would add, her conniving youngest son. But most of all, I remained puzzled at how a full-sized pear had seamlessly been squeezed into a large bottle of liqueur. On the sunny crest of Louis Hill, there were a few fruit trees. A dozen bottles hung off the branches. Someone had threaded the flowering buds through the neck until it was halfway into the stomach of each bottle. At first I guessed that René Magritte did not have far to go. As Yves walked past, I asked him, what fruit grows on these trees? He saw my eyes following the bobbing of the bottles in the gentle early summer breeze and chuckled, pears. The alcohol inspector made periodic but unannounced visits to the region. The D226 road out of Musi squiggles along the small Lac d'Anton where the woodchoppers stack their logs, and then it straightens as you pass the smaller village of Lay. John's house was the first in the village of Concy, and at that point the road makes a hairpin turn. The inspector was also a fan of John's novels. She usually arrived in the afternoon, and John immediately offered her coffee. Normally, John did not seek the attention of adoring fans, but during this coffee break, he would bring out his latest manuscripts. Meanwhile, Yves would mount his bike and warn all the neighbours to stash the stills and camouflage the bottles of gnôle. By the time she left John's house, everyone was smiling, happy to play cat and mouse with the inspector, and proud to be on the right side of the law. At the time I was writing my doctoral dissertation, postmodernism was frothing and throbbing in academia. I asked John what he thought of this concept. He looked slightly irritated by the question. Maybe it was the culmination of hay, dust and sweat that was stuck between his back and his blue signet. Or it could have just been that Yves was using up all the hot water. He took off the hat that he was wearing, smacked it on his knee and said, "Nothing useful about freedom has ever come from this word." Along the front of John's house was this bench, probably a pew from the village chapel. The postman left their mail there, and there was always something to pick and read. But we just sat there in silence and waited for Yves to finish the shower. John was not an anti-intellectual, but he was very impatient with academicism. His education in art and politics and ideas did not come from the university. He did go to Chelsea Art School, but more importantly, it was a generation of post-war refugees who were his teachers. His first novel, A Painter of Our Time, recounts the struggles of a Hungarian artist. The novel was inspired by the life of his friend and artist, Peter Perry. During my undergraduate years, two of my professors introduced me to John's writing. Don Miller lectured on art and politics, in which I discovered the collection of art essays, Permanent Red. Alan Davies, or Foo, as we reverentially referred to him, said that he had spent a year in London and would read John's weekly column in the New Statesman. "A total education in art, Nikos," he trumpeted. Foo also alerted me to a passage in John's book, Success and Failure of Picasso. The book chronicled the failure of the French Communist Party to seize the opportunity to work with his artistic genius. Picasso said joining the party was like a homecoming, but like in every family, there were a few assholes. However, Foo was more interested in the description of the partnership between Picasso and Braque in their pioneering Cubist experiment period. John said that they were like two mountain climbers, tethered to each other, levering from each other, and thereby scaling an unknown precipice together. A brilliant metaphor for collaboration, Foo declared. For those who were regular readers of John's newspaper and magazine columns, Ways of Seeing was not breaking news. It distilled 2 decades of thinking on the role of art in revealing truth, the struggle of artists to outwit ruling class worldviews, and the uses of new visual techniques to expand consciousness. John acknowledged that many of his ideas were derived from the genius of Walter Benjamin. In particular, he was in debt to Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. That essay was written in 1935 and first translated in English in 1969. John's former partner, Anya Bostock, was a translator. Anya is the mother of Katya, as well as John's other son, Jakob. She's also the cousin to our famous medical scientist, Gus Nossel, who I met at a Christmas party hosted by Louise Neri. Gus told me of the wonderful lunches at Anya's apartment in Geneva and how he loved having Katya and Jacob bounce up and down on his knees. Many years earlier, Katya had told me about this uncle of hers in Melbourne, a very famous scientist, she said, who she fondly remembered bouncing on his knees. Now, sorry for that little diversion, but I thought local references are useful. But it's also very typical of the conviviality in John's life. However, Anya also consolidated two very important streams in John's thinking. She was the translator of many of the key texts from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, in particular the writing of George Lukács. And in the TV series Ways of Seeing, Anya leads a feminist reading group that discusses the representation of the nude in art history. Refugees, women, artists, poets, and peasants, they all told stories that touched John. And from their experiences, he saw the world with a migrant's eye. My conclusion. A migrant's eye. Yes, that now seems obvious. But what is it? Many scholars with a grander vision than mine have attempted to give a definition or at least note some of its characteristics. Dante pointed out that when you leave home, everything seems to be odd. Even the bread tastes weird. Nietzsche hated those stay-at-home types and encouraged people to leave home and to leave their town just to see how small their buildings really are. Calvino had a good nose for the smells on foreign streets. Some would make you gag, he would say. Others would lead you into the shadows that you only dreamt of. Zimmel noted that the stranger's mentality was forever oscillating, comparing the spaces of here and there, cross-checking between the times of now and then. What these great minds all saw was that displacement was essential for critical thinking. It was not just a matter of contrast and evaluation, but also a willingness to challenge the singular measures that each culture produces for making sense of things. John preferred this unsettled and disoriented view to the smug perspective of the entitled. His eyes were flicker fast, intense in their pursuit of dark depths and eager to span the horizons. There was the blue of a Greek spring sky in his eyes. John chose to leave his native England. He expressed an affinity with the appreciation of ideas and culture in France. But he was not part of any Parisian club of scholars, artists, and writers. He lived between the village and the suburb. No one had ever called him a migrant or a refugee. Was he in exile? There is such a moral burden that comes with these labels, and I'm not sure he would have bothered to check. His energy was always focused on breaking boundaries. John trusted the eyes of migrants, the migrant's eye. Of course, some migrants move in order to gain fame and fortune. Most, however, leave because they have no choice. They leave to survive, to find a glimmer of freedom. I was driving in Athens with my father. We pulled off the ring road and stopped at the intersection of the entrance to the suburb of Papastergiadis. Sheltered from the midday sun were a small group of men, some selling little plastic handheld fans. The underpass was littered with pigeon shit, small mounds of old shoes, and a clump of fake designer bags. Why would you leave home in the prime of your life to come to this? I asked my father. He replied, Imagine how much worse life can be elsewhere for you to want to stay here. John looked into the eyes of migrants, not only to convey his empathy for their suffering, but he also tried to read the signs of the journey that they had undertaken. He needed to grasp the truth of their point of view, and in this, he was sure that there was also a measure of what really counts. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos, for that personal account of your life with John and John's life. And it just reaffirms why we're here tonight. But we're also here for a couple of other reasons. We've got a couple of book launches. First up, I'd like you to extend a warm welcome to Scott Maguire, who also works at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Melbourne, is a long-time collaborator with Nikos, author of numerous books on media, photography, and contemporary culture. Scott, the floor is yours. Better get into shot. Okay. I'm here to launch this beautiful book that Brad's made with Nikos, Art and Friendship. The book's bracketed by two really beautiful essays about artists who were or are still close friends of Nikos's. John Berger's the first one, and you've just heard a lot about John, and Carlos Capellan is the last one. I know there's an interview with Jacques Rancière at the end, but I'm cheating a bit here. In between, there's 14 other essays about artists, some of whom Nikos knew well and met often, others he met less often, perhaps, as with Michael Riley, only once, and others more rarely, not at all. Why do I begin here? It's to make the point, this is not just a book about artists who are Nikos's friends, although this happened in many cases and is important, but it's a book that explores the deeper connections between friendship as a distinctive mode of being with others in the world and the kind of worlding that art can produce. For Nikos, both friendship and art emerge from the desire to forge new connections through practices marked by curiosity, creativity and care. And what's so lovely in this book and remarkable and rare is the way Nikos takes you into a complex space where the personal, the public, the aesthetic, the ethical, the political all intermingle. So there's lots of stories in this book, some of which you've just heard a little bit of, lots of recountings of meetings and places and experiences, but there's also a really bold proposition about the role of art in helping us overcome the impasses of the present. Impasses that are simultaneously economic, political, ethical, questions concerning stolen land or disdain towards the plight of refugees are never far from Nikos's thoughts. And he's challenging us to ask, how can we imagine a more just, a more caring world? This doesn't mean this is a book with a neat set of answers, but nor is it full of pessimism, although it's not afraid to look painful experiences in the eye. In these essays, Nikos revisits issues he's worked with over a long time. If you look carefully, you can see how his own thinking has evolved as the question of cosmopolitanism starts to become a question of cosmos as much as polis. But that's rushing the story, so I want to go back a little bit. When Nikos first began writing about art and artists, and this is
probably the early 1980s, maybe the mid-1980s. Multiculturalism was a novel concept for both the art world and the academy. And it was a real challenge to get the art world to acknowledge cultural difference in a new way, to move beyond either ignoring or fetishising cultural difference and instead begin to understand the experience of migration and displacement as a critical lens for exploring key facets of contemporary culture. And I think this is a mission that Nikos has pursued for several decades, developing concepts around mobility, hybridity, translation. Through his work at the journal Third Text in London, and one of the dedications in this book is to Jean Fisher, who was very much part of that. Through many large and small catalogue essays, through talks at prestigious biennales and art exhibition openings, and perhaps most of all through hanging out with lots of artists in different cities around the world. And I think one of the great insights, perhaps even the key argument in this book, is that friendship is not just something personal. I mean, we all experience our friends on a personal level, but Nikos is asking us to recognise that friendship as a mode of being in the world is integral to the creative process. At the beginning of the book, Nikos quotes the artist Thomas Hirschhorn, who says, "Art and philosophy are not equals, but they can be friends." What does he mean? Well, first he's acknowledging that art and philosophy are different as modes of knowing, experiencing, understanding. Second, he's contesting that long and illustrious history in which philosophy is regularly claimed to be able to explain art. Hirschhorn rejects this idea, but more than this, in advocating friendship rather than equality, he's suggesting that art offers philosophy the potential to grow through a partnership, through a dialogue, through a dance. Art offers philosophy an encounter through its different language. Art says to philosophy, let's go somewhere else, we might end up somewhere. And this is the invitation that Nikos embraces. He's the first one on the dance floor. Nikos has always been a bit affronted, if not offended, by the idea that his task as a writer is to explain what an artist has done in their work. He seeks a looser, less defined relationship where ideas can spark off each other, where it no longer matters who came up with this or that idea, phrase or image. This looseness can be disconcerting to some artists who see themselves at the centre of their own stage. I'd add those artists aren't in this book. Nikos doesn't mind being on stage himself, but he's always a generous performer. He's willing to make room for others because his starting point is that a single perspective, even or perhaps especially his own, is never enough. So this is a book written by Nikos about others who are artists from all over the world. And it gives us rich insights into their ways of seeing and knowing and acting in the world. But at the same time, it shows us something really fundamental about Nikos, not only his deep thinking and his equally deep curiosity, but his deep faith in the generativity of art as a creative mode of encounter. Art, like friendship, opens new worlds to us. Both give us access to the cosmos if we let them. I want to end up on a personal note, because as some of you know, as many of you will know, Nikos and I have known each other for a long time now. It's almost 50 years. We went to school together, we've written together for more than 40 years, and we still work together in the same university department. Over this journey, we've experienced a lot with each other, all the normal adventures, some triumphs, challenges, failures, births and deaths. In short, our lives are all tangled up. Many years ago, when Nikos was first moving out of his family home, we considered sharing a house together. But his mother, wise woman that she is, said, "Don't you want to remain friends?" I don't know if that's the reason, but I'm proud to say we are still friends. And to you, my dear friend, my life would be much poorer without you. So let me commend this book to you. Reading it, I'm sure you will all learn, as I did, to appreciate anew what a precious friend Nikos is. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and I think that was very good advice from Kyria Eleni, all right? Our last presenter this evening, but by no means least, is Dr. Jasmine Peppercorn. She's a postdoctorate fellow and lecturer in media and communications at the University of Melbourne, and recently completed a major global survey in museum practices and a profile of Mona. Please welcome Jasmine to launch Museums of the Commons.
Hi everyone, it's my great privilege to be here this evening and to introduce this book, Museums of the Commons, L'Internazionale and the Crisis of Europe, by my friend and mentor Nikos Papastergiadis. So for those of you in the audience who once upon a time, like me, were a student under Nikos's supervision, actually scrap that, anyone who's had a conversation with Nikos will know he's very fond of saying zoom in, zoom out. His code for using the detailed moments and weaving them into a big picture analysis. In Museums of the Commons, he once again shows that he is the master of doing this. This book is a reflection on the conditions of trans-institutional collaboration through an engagement with L'Internazionale, a confederation of, at the time of writing, 6 museums in Europe. I'll jump straight into chapter 2, where Nikos kind of sets this context for the museums today with what he calls a bad binary. So the bad binary is the equally unbearable options of either individualized globalization or resurgent nationalism. In a time when museums are increasingly forced into justifying their existence through successful corporate sponsorships or by having this kind of global tourist appeal, Nikos is not one to take refuge in that kind of critique. And so in chapter 3, we're offered this idea of Museums of the Commons as an alternative trajectory, and the Confederation as providing an alternative structure for organising transnational and also trans-institutional collaborations. As Nikos acknowledges, there's a pragmatic component to this. You can have this kind of defensive sharing of resources, but he's also showing that it's much more than this. There's this creative urge underpinning this kind of organisation. I think one of the really important questions that this book considers is how we avoid the monopolisation of decision-making when we come to these centralised apparatuses, and how we enable sustainable modes of feedback and produce new social relations through collective negotiation. And so in this way, L'Internazionale also gives us pause to reflect on the geopolitics of Europe. There's a profound insight offered here by Nikos, that governance can take shape through conviviality. His correspondence and his interviews with museum directors that are all throughout the book offer an additional layer to this, that in organising together, friendship is not a supporting or a background factor, but it's a political agent and it's a driver of collaboration. Of course, we're talking about Nikos, so we don't just stop at the transnational scale. Chapter 4 of Museums of the Commons introduces the concept of Heterocosmoy, which is used to take Nikos's previous work around cosmopolitanism and move it to talking about specifically this space of the commons, but also this radical pluralism within that. Within this, there's also this return to that idea of creative urge through looking at the role of the imagination, and in that, and in the spirit of tonight, this is also a very beautiful homage to Berger in this section. We zoom back in again and we look at how L'Internazionale brings Heterocosmoy into the practices of constituents. From there, that line of thinking is carried over into chapter 6. The focus turns to art and what the museums can learn about learn from artists about the emancipation from authorial control. I think I've had a really lovely opportunity to reflect this evening on the words that Berger spoke in his beautiful introduction, particularly towards the end when he spoke about hope and also about how we all follow each other. This is the second book launch that I've been to in this room. The first time I ever came to this room was in 2012. It was for a book launch for a book called Cosmopolitanism and Culture. It was the year that I first met Nikos. And over the years, I've really come to recognise a consistent approach in Nikos's work, one that he actually self-identifies in the conclusion of Museums of the Commons, when he says that he hopes to convey the optimism that comes with a new experiment, but also the heavy-hearted analysis of the structures for spawning solidarity. He certainly achieves this. There is the heavy-hearted analysis of our contemporary moment, but we're also presented with a different, more hospitable path. Like with all of Nikos's work, there's an electric undercurrent of hope in Museums of the Commons. Nikos, thank you for letting me follow you.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I just would like to again thank our presenters, Nikos, Scott and Jasmine, for tonight's presentations. Thank you. I would like to, in conclusion, thank the board here of the Greek community for their support in this project, and I'd also like to acknowledge the hard work of our staff. George Merides is the Director of the Cultural Centre, Gosa Valentia, our IT expert, Antonia Tsamis. These events don't happen just by accident. They happen with a lot of dedication and hard work to people that work long hours. So I hope you had a good evening, and we'll see you at our next project. Thank you very much.